Hi, everybody. Welcome. It looks like folks are still filtering in, so we'll take a couple of minutes here and get started as soon as we're seeing a quorum here. All right. Great. We're at 5 after the hour, so if folks still are finding their way in, that's great, but we'll at least go ahead and start introducing our speaker today and the series. Some of you might be wondering what a virtual colloquium is, which is a term that, at least as far as we could tell, we made up, but we made it up for a reason. So if I can get my screen, perfect. What's motivating us today is that, over 2 years ago, a lot of the folks that you're going to see presenting over the course of this series started noticing a number of the conversations that were happening amongst medical educators and informaticians were asking very similar questions of each other. How do people learn, and how might technology support them? How can learners be supported as they apply knowledge in clinical practice? And how do we assess learners when they practice in complex care delivery systems where education is only part of the mission? And so as these conversations have progressed, what we learned was that our communities might share these questions and these goals, but we really kind of have a limited knowledge of each other when it comes to the language that we speak, the concepts that inform our work, and the methods that we use. And so because of this, what we really saw that we needed was to speak to and understand each other really through a conversation. And that's what we'll really sort of aim to do over this series. So if as you'll see, we have our next session coming up on Monday, so we hope that you're able to join us for that. And the first question that we ask is the first question that I just described. How do educators and information systems support people in their learning? And we have a wonderful panel that will be approaching that question from their own perspectives and their own work. And it will proceed with another session focused on how learners can be supported during clinical practice. The date on this will be announced shortly, so stay tuned to your emails for that. And then a third session focused on assessment and how do we assess learners that are embedded in these complex care delivery systems. And finally, to wrap it all up, we'll have a reflective session looking back at the rest of the series and asking the question about, what does this convergence of informatics and medical education look like? And really, like I said, the goal here is for this to be a conversation. And so we invite you to really participate in this series, be a part of the conversation and the community. You can sign up at dbhi.chop.edu if you haven't already to receive updated invitations to the rest of the series as the dates get finalized. And today we would love for you to use the Q&A functionality as we go through the discussion, and I'll be responsible for sharing your questions and comments with our speaker. And really, we just hope that this series is a great starting point for you. So with that said, I am very excited to welcome Dr. Dan Schumacher today. He has really had an incredible career at the forefront of pediatric medical education. He began his work in resident assessment by being part of the Pediatric Milestones Working Group, which developed the ACGME pediatric milestones that's used by all ACGME accredited pediatric training programs today. He went on to be Associate Program Director for the Pediatric Residency Program at Boston Children's Hospital and Boston Medical Center. And from there, he decided to focus on medical research in competency-based medical education. And so he currently leads that work as Director of the Education Research Unit at Cincinnati Children's Hospital, and we're excited to learn more about that today. For his research, he is the recipient of the prestigious Macy Faculty Scholar Award from the Macy Foundation, and he has also received Cincinnati Children's Educational Achievement Award in 2018. And he is also a member of the select group of International Competency-Based Medical Education Collaborators. So really, it's my great pleasure and honor to welcome Dr. Dan Schumacher today, and I will turn it over to him.
Thank you guys so much for having me. You can hear me and see my slides okay?
Yep, we can see you and see your slides, I think.
All right, outstanding. So my goal really, so the sort of the intro that Naveen gave, I think is, my goal is to not encroach on any of the upcoming talks, but rather to set them up and get us thinking a little bit big picture about how we see the world, don't see the world, and how that can impact our ability to work or not be able to work as well together. Just sort of get thinking at like that little bit of a higher level. So to do this, my goal is to get us to think about comparing and contrasting dominant paradigms in informatics and medical education, and discuss how the dominant paradigms can either promote or thwart our ability to work together in multidisciplinary or hopefully transdisciplinary work. And then I think everyone on this probably already bought into this, but I think to really, increase the people seeing the value of the importance in working at the intersectionality rather than in our sort of separate silos. So I'll just start with a couple of things. So I think medical education has a problem. There's more and more studies that are coming out that demonstrate in quite a notable way that we do not prepare people at the end of training to meet the needs of patients. And this is just a handful of articles that show that the imprinting that happens in residency is pretty strong and can last for 10, 15, 20 years outside of training. In sort of the, if you are trained not to be as good of a provider as you can be, that sticks with you for a long time. And so that's sort of one thing. And the other thing is that we don't do a good job of even preparing anyone to meet the needs of patients for really fundamental things, common things that people see. This is a real problem that we have. In medical education, a lot of people are talking about how all we need is more data to fix this problem. If we can just harness the EHR to get a better sense of what we're doing and not doing, and really understand these relationships between the educational efforts we have and outcomes, both outcomes of learning and how those relate to outcomes for patients, that this will fix everything that ails us. So that we need informatics. I think that there's a lot that's true about this, and but as we'll sort of unpack, I think that we might just be going from one paradigm of viewing the world to another paradigm. Maybe somewhere in the middle is where we need to be. On the other side, I think informatics has a problem as well, right? This article by Atul Gawande, why do doctors hate their computers? This is a problem that you guys are trying to fix as well, right? I love this article actually, and I think that this really unpacks for me sort of the problems that we're up against with electronic health records. Some of you maybe have seen this article where they implemented Epic in Denmark, and it was a total disaster actually. So you see the quote here that someone described it as a indescribable total chaos. Many who were there are still traumatized by having seen battle-hardened doctors and nurses weeping openly for days. And Denmark said we did a great job of exporting burnout from our country to their country. So this is a problem, and yes, sort of so one of the problems they encountered was that Denmark is not all about billing; it's more about patient care. But I'm going to suggest, and maybe this will come up in questions, that we need to think a little bit more about how and I know you guys are thinking about this, but how do we use the EHR and how do we force the EHR vendors to get us to use the EHR in ways that benefit patients, not just billing? So, this kind of all gets at, sort of the idea of social technical theory, right? That, sort of like things sort of come about by how people interact with technology and the environment and so like I sort of said that we need informatics to help us in medical education. I think that medical educators tend to think more about these social aspects of systems, and I think that we tend to go deeper in that area and maybe have something to offer to informatics in that way. So I'm just going to set up a sort of like a example sort of here of how different ways of viewing the world can become problematic. So I was actually living in Boston at the time that the TSA decided that they were going to do chat downs, which is literally a line of sort of people that check you in at security. It was a line of 15, even 20 people, and they had trained these people how to notice subtle sort of ways that your face contorts itself or ways that you look. To sort of determine, are you a safe person to let through or not? They really thought that this was going to be a good way to sort of enhance security, doing this chat down, this talking to you, this asking questions, sort of what immigration officials do when you go to other countries. So my first time at Logan Airport in Boston to do this, the guy in front of me, and I am not embellishing this story at all. The guy in front of me was a guy dressed all in black with a long trench coat and a black hat, who was, emotionless expressions and looked like kind of a shady guy, to be totally honest. So he got to chat down and they asked him his questions I couldn't hear because they made you stand so far away, and they let him through. And I thought, boy, this guy just sure seems shady. He got stopped when his luggage went through the conveyor. They stopped him and they made him open his luggage. And in his luggage, his roll-on luggage was only sort of three things. One pair of rumpled up clothes, a pair of khaki pants, a pair of underwear, and a shirt. Several canisters of dry carpet cleaner, and I kid you not, a book entitled Nemesis. And I thought, wow, this chat process does not feel very effective. I thought this guy was shady before, and now he's coming in with several canisters of dry carpet cleaner, one set of clothes, and a book entitled Nemesis. I hope that this guy is not on my flight. Well, I was not the only person that thought that this chat down, people thought this is a really clear way of seeing the world. This chat down is going to help us. It's going to increase security. but it had a lot of issues. One of them was racial profiling. So people said, okay, yes, this is not a good way to be viewing the world. We got to fix the subjective judgment of these TSA officials with something more objective. We really should harness facial recognition for this. So sort of like taking a totally different paradigm, right? From the idea that subjective things are going to help you to the idea that something more objective is going to help you. Well, I'm sure you will not be surprised to find out this is from just a few weeks ago that the facial recognition stuff is also racist and gender biased. It's baked into the algorithms. So that way of viewing the world also did not work. I just give sort of one other example because I think that these paradigms and how we see the world really influence the way that we can think about things in very different ways, and it can lead us to see and not see things that we want to be able to see. So this, as some of you may know, is General McNamara, who was the U.S. Secretary of Defense in the 1960s. And he really believed, he was a quantitative person. He really thought things you can count, you ought to count. Loss of life is one. So he was in charge of sort of the U.S. efforts in the Vietnam War. He came from the Ford Motor Factory. The focus on quantitative data served him well there. So he liked counting things like troops on the ground, enemies that are killed, land that you've taken. But he overly focused on that way of seeing the world. It was really detrimental, actually. He did not think about, not all soldiers are the same. Some of them don't want to be there. Some of them don't try very hard. Others want to be there and try very hard. They also did not consider how the Vietnamese felt. And this led to guerrilla warfare. And as you know, ultimately, the U.S. did not fare well in the Vietnam War. And it's really at the, at the sort of the way, one way of viewing the world that did not work out for success. People have sort of talked about this being the McNamara fallacy, right? That, you can first measure what's easily measurable, and that's okay as far as it goes. The second step is to throw away anything you can't easily measure, and that's artificial and misleading. The third step is to presume that what can't be measured easily is not important. That's blindness. It's turning off to things that you need to be attending to. The fourth step is to say that what can't easily be measured doesn't really even exist, and that's really where all things end. So this again, I'm trying to illustrate here that ways of viewing the world can really set us up for success if we are willing to see the world in different ways. It can really set us up for failure if we get too pigeonholed into our sort of like silo of ways of seeing the world. I love this quote from Kenneth Burke. A way of seeing is also a way of not seeing. So McNamara viewing the world in a very quantitative way, he did not see things that were really important. So let's use sort of this framing to sort of talk about dominant paradigms in medical education and informatics. First, starting with a confession. I think that you invited me for my post-positive work that I think some of you know about. And post-positivist, I'll unpack what that means in just a moment, but it's basically more quantitative focused work. And I have done some of that work. So like, as some of you will know, I've developed these things called resident sensitive quality measures that really are two things. They are one, quality measures that are important to illnesses of interest. So here's like three: asthma, bronchiolitis, and closed head injury in the emergency department. They're also likely done by a resident and not the team collectively or other members of the team. And by the way, we'll unpack that a little bit more about the ability to maybe sort out an individual from the team. We'll unpack that a little bit more later. But we actually found that these quality measures that you can get out of the EHR are actually have a pretty good range to them, and people don't uniformly perform well in them. And so from an assessment standpoint, they are discriminatory. They can distinguish between one learner or another in ways that oftentimes the typical ways of doing assessment can't. So this is kind of a more quantitative way of viewing the world. Here's the problem. I'm actually more of a constructivist, more of a qualitative thinker. And that's where I think medical education is increasingly headed. Lambert, Schumacher, and Case Vandervluten talked about the history of assessment in medical education. They talked about how, in the 60s, psychometrics, and multiple choice tests, that was really the prevailing thing, right? The idea of putting human judgment into sort of determining someone's performances, that's like the anathema of what you want to be doing. But that's actually the most recent sort of like era of assessment in medical education is not that actually. We are now in an assessment as judgment phase. And Brian Hodges wrote about this beautifully. Assessment in the post-psychometric era, learning to love the subjective and the collective. Human judgment has a role in determining performance. And there's another good quote from Ollie Tenkate and Glenn Regehr about the power of subjectivity in assessment. They said, educators are now arriving at the insight that subjective expert judgments by medical professionals are not only unavoidable, but actually should be embraced as the core of assessment in medical trainees. This quantitative assessment data, not really where it's at, is what people are thinking. And I did it, so I've done a study that sort of looked at this. We sort of, took these quality measures that I developed, we put them in the hands of the people that make summative decisions for a residency program, the clinical competency committee members, and we saw what they did with it. And to be honest, I think that a qualitative approach of actually seeing what they did with it and having them explain what they did with it, I actually think was more valuable than sort of the distribution that we had, because that distribution can't stand alone. It's kind of, people are going to use that to incorporate in decisions that they're going to make. So I've kind of used these terms post-positivist and constructivist. So I think it's important to take a step back and define what is a paradigm. So a paradigm is just a set of common beliefs and agreements shared between people about how problems should be understood and addressed. So I'm going to stop here and we're going to do a poll. What do you see here? And I think that Hannah is putting a poll in the blue jeans for us. By the way, I can't see the poll. You guys tell me when the poll is done and what the distribution was.
Poll is active right now. I'll keep you posted.
Okay.
So relatively even split emerging, Dan, with chocolate candies as sort of a slight winner, and then Skittles and one photo repeating several times about even, and then Spree candies lagging behind. And I think there's one vote for something else.
Okay. Yeah. Did anyone vote for the sort of the three-dimensional circles? Was that the one other vote?
There was 11 floating balls was the other option that nobody picked.
11 floating balls. No one picked that. That would actually be my answer to it. So by the way, I think that all of these answers are correct. You all are bringing your previous experience and how you view the world answering this question. These very well could be M&Ms, Sprees, Skittles. These could be, it is a repeating, if you look at it carefully, it is sort of looks to be a repeating image, so that's very fair. This is actually a magic eye. I don't know if any of you remember those from, like the 80s and the 90s or whenever they came out, but whereas some people are able to sort of like cross their eyes. By the way, you can do this on the computer screen as I have it up here. Some people are able to cross their eyes and see something three-dimensional. For people that see this and know this is a magic eye and cross their eyes, there's actually a series of balls that are floating three-dimensionally here. So also a fair answer. People that love magic eye like me and are able to see that. So the point of this exercise is sort of like emphasize that, what we see depends on what we look at, but also what our previous sort of experience has taught us to see. And this can lock us into things in good ways and bad ways. So from a research standpoint, right, how we view the world or our paradigm influences everything that comes after that. It influences questions we ask, how we go about addressing those questions through methodology and methods, how we collect and analyze data, and ultimately how we view the results of our data. And I think that, there's always more than one way to sort of see something. And so now I'll sort of unpack just briefly what sort of this post-positivism and constructivism sort of is. Positivism suggests that there's one truth out there and we can know it. It's objective. We can definitely know it. This would be something like gravity. I think we all would acknowledge that there's a truth about gravity. If I drop something, it's going to fall to the ground. We can watch that thing fall to the ground. We tend to agree with. But a lot of things can't be so easily captured like that. So post-positivism has really sort of fallen away to be, or positivism has fallen away a little bit to be, post-positivism. There is one truth but we can never fully get our hands around it. Really, the best that we can do is make a hypothesis about our understanding of that truth for now. But it's open to change in the future, as we test that hypothesis, right? I think about sort of, margarine and butter is kind of maybe a good example of this, right? Like, when I was growing up, people thought butter, bad for you. We got to do margarine. And now people are like, margarine, bad for you. There's probably a truth out there, right? Is margarine or butter good or bad for you? But our understanding of it changes as we sort of test out hypotheses about whether or not they're good and how we define good. And so you can't really fully ever get your hand around it. I'll just give an illustration of this about duty hours. So Jason Frank last year in relation to one of the new duty hours articles that came out of our friends in Boston, said the latest resident duty hours trial in MedEd trial in New England Journal, the headline reads, shorter shifts led to greater patient harm. But is that the whole story? These are complex systems. What's your take? But Eric Warm, who works across the street from me here, said, in a secondary analysis that adjusted for a number of patients per resident physician as a potential confounder, intervention schedules were no longer associated with an increase in errors. It's not hours, it's workload and compression. Interesting. The researchers had a way of viewing the world. This is about hours. But other people viewing the world in a different way said, no, that's not about hours. This is about work and work compression. Just different ways of viewing the world that lead you to draw a really different conclusion. And Liam Kazak, who's a pediatrician up in Canada, said this is a perfect example of not studying a complex system through the methodologies appropriate for the study of complex systems. If you have a hammer, everything is a nail. Sometimes you need an Allen key because your system is an IKEA bookshelf in terms of complexity. And I know that I would be talking in a number of talks about positivism and post-positivism and constructivism. So I said, an important reminder that even positivist and post-positivist paradigms are indeed stances that lead you to see and not see things and make and not make certain claims. Far from being magisterial in its objectivity, science was conditioned by the history, society, and prejudices of scientists, even those who think they're being very objective in their post-positivist way of viewing the world. So constructivism sort of turns this on its head. And a lot of people that are post-positivists think constructivists are crazy. A lot of people that are constructivists think post-positivists are crazy. Because a constructivist posits that there's multiple truths. They're constructed by and between people. There's not just one truth that we can observe. The idea to someone that's strictly a post-positivist, this is a crazy idea to them. But I'll give you an example. My definition of love and what that means and what that constitutes and what that feels like is probably really constructed by me and the people that I know. And it's true to me, like my definition of love, but probably the people on this call have different ideas for what love is. And that's probably also your truth. There's, this maybe is an example of where, there are multiple truths that sort of can exist. So the goal of unpacking this all is that I'm going to build on this in just a moment. The goal is to really say that, there's one way of viewing the world is not better than another. They offer different perspectives that really, if we are able to see the world in different ways, I think can be complementary and beneficial and expand what we're able to see and not see. And I think that medical education and informatics can tend to be just like a lot of other things in medicine can tend to be siloed and sort of have their dominant way of seeing the world that is at the exclusion of other ways of seeing the world that probably is really beneficial. So let me give some examples of like other paradigms that I think I see and how we might be able to sort of mash these between our fields. So just the first consideration is that I do think that we have good commonality that grounds both of us. And I think that's a good starting place. I think that we both have a patient-focused way of going about the world. The competency-based medical education is all the rage in medical education right now. And competency-based medical education really posits that we should start with the needs of patients and then back into what are the competencies that physicians need to be able to provide that care to patients? And then how do we make sure that physicians achieve those competencies during training and after training to be able to provide that care to patients? It's all about, competency-based medical education is all about ensuring high-quality care to patients. You guys are doing the same thing, right? The goal of informatics is to improve patient care and to try to mitigate the human messiness and errors that might sort of like make giving quality care put it asunder. So we both sort of have that grounding, and we both have a focus on sort of how we need to interact with the learner or stakeholder in a way that sort of meets them where they're at and makes it and helps them sort of improve from where they are, right? We both have this sort of like learner stakeholder centered sort of approach. So we've got a good foundation, right, in sort of what drives us. And by the way, this learner centered idea, putting the learner in the driver's seat, is the other sort of hallmark of CBME. So I just go quickly through these because we already talked about that. So now let's talk about sort of the differences that we have and how we might sort of like think about them to sort of help one another. So I do think, and by the way, I'm not trying to create false polarities here and sort of like put people on two ends of a spectrum, but I do think that I see more post-positivist or quantitative work that is coming from informatics. And I think I do see more constructivist work that is coming from medical education. This idea that multiple truths sort of exist and, that they're created by and between people, and how do we make sense of that sort of messy social world. Again, this is not exclusionary. I definitely recognize that you guys recognize the importance of talking to people to learn more about sort of like what you're looking at and how to work with sort of like quantitative data and things like that. But by and large, I think that we maybe tend one way or the other a little bit more than we need to or want to, and maybe viewing the world in different ways can be helpful in this way. I also think that the theories that are guiding our work, again, these are getting back to like Kuhn's definition of paradigms. These are sort of the prevailing ways of understanding the world, and sort of making sense of the relationships between concepts that help us understand the world. And I think that we have our theories that we lean on the most, again, in our different fields, and maybe there's more room for cross-population. Just give a couple of examples here. So I think that there are some things that are important to both of us that I think we capitalize on, such as learning theories like cognitive load, right? I think we both get that if the task is hard for someone, that it's hard to understand, and we give them too many tasks at once, they become overwhelmed and they're not able to perform as well, and they're not able to learn as well. I think that we sort of both understand that, right? Situated learning, right? We both recognize that learning is inextricably linked to and arising from the environment in which we work with people, right? And that we need experiences to help us learn, right? It can't just be, you learn best in the real messy clinical world, right? I think we both fields, I think, really understand this. But I think there are some things in both fields that we don't really pick up as much as we should in the other field. So some things in informatics I think we need to focus on way more in medical education is the idea of systems engineering and human factors, or systems engineering and human factors engineering, right? I think that this is a scary topic to medical educators, but I think that, right, this is where the world is at, right? If we want to improve care, these are important sort of like, things to sort of like lean on and build from in sort of, training people and ensuring that they, work in the system that they work in to provide the best care that's possible. I think that medical education also has some theories that may benefit informatics. So the idea of self-determination theory, that we maximize engagement and the desire to learn. Self-determination theory really focuses on you need to feel, one of the things is you need to feel a sense of competence and you need to feel a sense of autonomy to really have the desire and drive to learn. And that's important. This, again, beginning back to this, learner-centered way of doing things. I also think that this idea of zones of proximal development is really important for optimizing continued learning. And this sort of posits that, there are the things that we can do on our own right now, without any help. But then there's sort of like this layer outside of that of things that we can do with some help. This gets at the idea of providing just the right amount of scaffolding to people to help them take those next steps. And that's really important actually for their continued development. And I think that, as we introduce sort of like human factors and job aids just as an example, into the electronic medical record, I think that this idea of providing just enough scaffolding to help people adopt something new or change their care in a way that's beneficial by sort of prompts that they're given or the way that they interact with the system, I think, I think that the idea of providing just enough scaffolding to help them take those next steps is really important. However, just this last bullet here, I also think that this is challenged by the fact that everyone's got their own learning trajectory. So this somehow needs to be individualized if we're going to do it in the best way. Right, here's a study that shows that, competence increases over time. We don't need to like dissect it any more than that. You can see that these residents from the beginning of residency to the end of residency, for the things that were measured, they moved up. But if you look at each of them as an individual, they have totally different learning curves. And how do we sort of meet each person where they're at and help them take their next steps? This becomes a lot more complicated of an effort. So then the final consideration, and I want to pause here actually, because I know that Naveen wanted to have a discussion about this, is, who's responsible for providing care? I think that medical education tends to think about this as individual clinicians. I think quality improvement tends to think about this as the team. I think that informatics tends to think about this as the system. By the way, I think that people that are, predominantly viewing this as a system thing recognize there's individuals in it and teams in it. And I'm not saying that, I'm not trying to pigeonhole any one person here, but I do think that, these are sort of three silos that exist in medicine that do tend to have a predominant way of viewing things. And, this is, an issue because it's complicated, right? Care is provided by teams and systems. And that's ultimately the most important thing. But we graduate, certify, and credential individuals. So I would posit that being able to pull out the individual from those teams and systems is really important, because otherwise, how are we going to make these graduation, certification, and credentialing decisions? Naveen, you, I think, had some really cool questions that reflected on this fourth point.
Sure. Yeah, Dan. I got a little preview, so I got a chance to throw some ideas at you before you started today. But yeah, the specific question that I had around this is, you mentioned that there is this idea of systems engineering that we really try to apply in informatics, and one of the principles there is this real this acceptance that human performance variation is a thing, but what we really try to do is build systems around that variation so that no matter how much variation there is, we really minimize or even eliminate that variation's impact on care quality and safety that the patient experiences. And so I'm curious, as you think about, this part here and your work with attribution, how you imagine even like trying to like look for the signal as more and more of that human factors and systems engineering takes off in healthcare.
Yeah, I know. I think this is a really tricky question, actually. So there's sort of two things I think about this. Physicians are humans. Even worse, they're humans that resist change and being told what to do. So I think as long as we have humans involved, who have free will, I think that we have a problem, and I think that we have limitations in I think that there's a limit to the human factors engineering that we are able to do. But even more troublesome than this, or not more troublesome, but even maybe more, it's kind of provocative maybe, but I'm not sure how provocative it is actually. I think that medicine is headed toward a world where artificial intelligence is probably should already be integrated more into what we're doing than it is. But when I'm going to say some potentially radical things. When a machine is your new doctor, what is left for the human doctor to do? Things that are actually harder to attribute to them, but really important. Things like wisdom, knowing when to do a test and when not to do a test, and why. Making decisions that don't fit the pattern. Some of you may have seen the diagnosing skin lesions where they taught the computer sort of, skin lesions and blueberry muffins and chihuahuas, and the computer doesn't do a very good job always of distinguishing those. So there are things that don't fit the pattern, and I don't know that. Even as systems get more complex, there will be times when this human judgment, this wisdom, is important. But that's a lot harder to get our hands around, right? If we're struggling with what to attribute to individuals now, I think it's going to be even harder, but that's a really important thing. Or what about compassion? I love this article by Brian Hodges. Without compassion, there is no healthcare, right? So in the technological age, right, the human sort of, piece of this is, going to involve things that are already more nebulous and hard to measure. Maybe we can pick up with this with some more questions, but I actually want to leave a good 15 minutes at the end here to really have discussion, take more questions, and really talk as a group. I'm just going to leave with some concluding thoughts. Maybe in the interest of time and being able to get more discussion, rather than have you guys do a poll about what this is, I'll just tell you that this is a marshland. So why is this in my concluding talks? A marsh is where a land ecosystem and the aquatic ecosystem come together. And there is actually the greatest biodiversity that happens in that marshland, where these two ecosystems come together. And so I sort of think about this like medical education is one ecosystem, clinical informatics is another ecosystem, and I think that the most powerful things that we can be doing are at this intersection here, where we really, where the full breadth and depth what each ecosystem has is sort of brought together. I think the rich stuff can be done there, just like the richest biodiversity is in a marshland. This is just a quote from an article that was from some medical educators that does exactly what I just said. That there's diversity of thought in these places where multidisciplinary collaboration and transdisciplinary collaboration can happen. And for me, this all gets me back to the idea of a way of seeing is a way of not seeing. And I think that the more that we can understand and even adopt and internalize the ways that others view the world, I think that we're able to do greater things. And I'm hoping that I hope that I am convincing you guys of that. And so I did not give maybe answers how we can work together, but I'm trying to get us, but we can certainly talk about that in the last 15 minutes. But I am trying to get us thinking about the importance of working together, and not just working together in a way that's multidisciplinary, where I'm in a medical education discipline, you guys are in an informatics discipline, but in a transdisciplinary way, where we sort of transcend our discipline to be able to do the most important work in the middle that becomes sort of its own, if you will, discipline of working together.
That's
I'll leave
amazing.
it there.
Yeah, Dan, you're probably able to see the comments and questions as you stop screen sharing, but I'll just tell you. So you did. Jill Posner was able to see your magic eye, and Doreen Conner had a quick thank you for the theoretical content as well. But there is a question. So from Ellen Deutsch. She said, as a student of human factors engineering, systems and resilience engineering, really appreciated the multiple link concepts. And so when we start thinking about things like wisdom and judgment, how do we sort of optimize and appreciate those qualities? And what is, as you just said, what does a transdisciplinary maybe concept of wisdom and judgment look like?
I know, this is hard, right? Like measuring wisdom, measuring judgment. So I could tell you, I mean, so again, acknowledging now that, that I've got my way of seeing the world, I actually think that it's going to be hard to take out, like, we're not going to be able to just develop a tool that we can measure these things with. I think that we are going to need human judgment in determining what is wisdom and what is judgment. And even if we find some, if you will, more objective things that we can be looking for, still think that we need to have humans like looking at that data and making sense of it and making decisions.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you say that, right? Because I will confess, right, that your perception, at least of me as an informaticist, is felt a little like on target. In that when we sort of embarked on this, series and creating this and thinking through these questions, I didn't necessarily think we were sort of going down this path of like epistemology, right? And like, how do we know something? What methods are, are even valid to establish that something is true? And I'm curious, I mean, is that sort of a limitation as an informatician? Or how widely spread do you think these ideas are in medical education and healthcare broadly? And, is that even like is that like people don't know what they don't know, and how are they even going to pursue this path if they don't know what they don't know?
The reason I spent so much time on paradigms and post-positivism and constructivism is that I actually think that I think we all have these. We have our ways of seeing the world that dominate the way that we think about things, but I don't think that we name them and acknowledge them and name and acknowledge the ways that we don't predominantly see the world. And I think that there's value in doing it, which is why I spent the time sort of like unpacking that a little bit. We do not do any better of a job of doing this in medical education. I will admit that, that this has become a bit more of a discussion, in the medical education research world. Sort of like, really being important in knowing your paradigm, but still most people working in medical education don't really, it's not part of the way that they normally think about the world.
Yeah. And I mean, if that's sort of a broad gap, is that actually like the first area that that the two communities need to think about, is even how do we sort of make that idea accessible to people, that whatever methods they use sort of have these implicit, conceptions of knowledge baked into them.
I think that that's true. Yes, I agree. Yeah, especially because I do think that we, again, not to like sort of put people in buckets that are solitary buckets, but I do think that we do have differences in sort of the predominant ways that we, sort of like view the world, and that overcoming those, if we can, I think actually has value.
Great. And so I will also ask one other question, as there's another thank you for your amazing talk in the chat. One of the, again, early set, I sort of mentioned these questions that we were hearing in these conversations that we were that I was seeing between folks from the informatics world and medical education world. Another sort of common version of this conversation is sort of concerns from the broader medical community that current generations of trainees, because of the electronic health record or because of the ultrasound, whatever novel technology, right, are really sort of like losing skills, right? And so how do you sort of think about the evolution of what the competencies are that are needed by health systems, that are needed by patients, as these technologies evolve?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you bring up a good point in the way that you asked the question. I think that we do need individual people competencies around technology. And we also need, that we can debate maybe when we have more time, the competencies around medical knowledge and patient care, because, I really think that this artificial intelligence machine sort of like, I think this is coming and already here in some extent. And I think it does question what's important competencies that might be in the future world for that. But I also think that we need systems competencies. And I think we need systems competencies related to technology, actually. And I don't think that the systems are currently delivering on this. So I'm going to be a little bit provocative here. Brian Hodges, the book that I showed, the Orange Book, has talked about he's a talented medical education researcher who's talked actually about where artificial intelligence may fit into the future of medicine. And he's talked about the idea of defining competencies for the electronic health record and credentialing and certifying the electronic health record as if for a doctor. And I actually feel like we may get there, right? Currently, I think if we were to, go to Epic and say, we're going to we're going to determine if your electronic health record and, can provide good care, and we're going to credential it. I think that we would have some barriers there about how likely we would feel that we want to credential it, because it's still a system that is designed for billing. And despite the fact that you guys are doing amazing things in the informatics world to fight that, and even working with Epic to change that, you're a little hamstrung in some ways, right? By the fact that, American healthcare needs to be able to bill. But just think about how that would change, right? If we were to think about defining a competency for their health record.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because there is definitely, Ellen's on this call. There are other human factors aligned folks who, hopefully I won't misrepresent their position, but there is sort of this idea that, a lot of the idea of training around a technology, right, is really sort of overhead associated with the technology. And if the technology is well designed, right, really all you should really need is the medical knowledge, and then the technology would be relatively intuitive to be able to use. And so I'm curious if that, again, is the kind of thing where you sort of go back to what you said about systems engineering earlier, and you said, listen, people are still human, they're still going to need this, or how you think about that question.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's really good. No, I think that, So if you take some of that human part out of it, and the machine is sort of like more involved, I actually think that the idea of honestly the idea of credentialing the machine, if you will, or something along those lines, I think is going to be really important. And I think it's really going to shift what we do with the humans, with what's left, right? These wisdom, compassion, these other things that are quite honestly harder to measure, but those become the more important things, right? I actually think that this is where transdisciplinary sort of like things might come in the future for us, actually. Medical educators have thought a lot about credentialing. That's sort of like the big part of what they do, right, for certifying. But I don't think they really thought about how they might think about that when a machine is part of the equation, right? But they've thought about the human part of it, right? This is an example, right, of where, and I don't think that this is actually crazy futuristic thinking. I think that these general ideas, I think, are coming. And so I'm just trying to acknowledge that, I think the world is moving this way, right? When a radiologist when a machine can read the X-rays from a radiologist better than the radiologist, what a radiologist looks like is different, right? Their role in what radiographic test are you going to do, or what decision are you going to make that, or this didn't fit the pattern, or that wisdom becomes more and more important.
Great. See one more. Thank you, Dan, from Don for another excellent talk. And he sort of points out that that the human factors engineering component is very interesting and maybe one that we underappreciate. And so with the last few minutes, Dan, maybe I'll ask you to comment a little bit on, as we sort of think about working towards this confluence in medical education and informatics, what are the kinds of activities that you think sort of get us to this transdisciplinary future that you're describing?
Yeah. I think that what we're doing right now is what we need to be doing more of. Series that you guys are doing, I think you guys are visionary and really smart. I think that the way that you work together is you get out of silos and you start talking together, right? There are undoubtedly things that I have said during this that people have thought he's crazy for saying that, or other things that I have said that people thought I've never really thought of it that way. This is the same thing that happens for me when I sit down with an informatician, right? There are things that you guys say that I think they are crazy for saying that. But then when I probe more and to understand why you said that, I realize, oh no, that makes perfect sense. Again, getting back to this idea of every way of seeing is way of not seeing. Once I learn more, I'm like, I can't believe I did not see the world in a way that included that line of thinking, right? It's actually not crazy. It's actually really intelligent. But unless I'm in a room and having these discussions, right, at the cutting edge of the fields, you can't have those revelations, right? And I don't think it's a talking at one another like I should read of your literature, you should read some of my literature. I think it's actually engaging in dialogue and discussion and, at the cross-cutting edge like you guys are doing with this series. I think we need more of this.
Awesome. Well, that's a plug that we did not pay Dan to provide for us. But thank you, Dan, for this amazing sort of start to that conversation. And hopefully you're able to join us for more of the sessions then moving forward. Definitely, I think your expertise and thought leadership in this area is very much appreciated as we go through and have this conversation. So we're excited for that. And as we're in the last minute, I'll also remind folks in the audience that the next session is Monday at this same time. We have our excellent panel that includes local participants here, as well as Evan Orenstein, who is a returning participant. And then Hannah might be able. We'll expect for folks. I realized I forgot to address CME. So for folks that are looking for CME credit, we will follow up with you by email to get you the survey to be able to claim CME credits. But hopefully we will see many of you back on Monday and expect that in your email as well. So thank you, Dan. I think we're at the top of the hour, so we will let you go. Thanks for your time and your thought and all of the effort that you put into the discussion today.
Yeah, thank you all for having me.